Hello, in this video I am going to give a overview of epithelial tissues. So epithelial tissues are sometimes also referred to as epithelia. And basically what we have in an epithelial tissue is just a group of cells that are packed really close together with very little extracellular matrix between them. So extracellular matrix is the stuff that we find outside of the cells in the body. And there's very little of that in epithelial tissues. Think of epithelial tissues as like a brick wall, where the bricks are laid one against another with very little mortar in between. So when we look at epithelial tissues, we are going to expect to see mostly just lots of cells with very little space between the cells. The function of an epithelial tissue is really mostly dependent upon the thickness. We have thin and thick epithelial tissues. The thicker epithelial tissues tend to function in protection. We're going to find this in places like on the outside of the skin and the inside of the mouth. Whereas the thinner epithelial tissues tend to function in getting stuff into and out of the body. Like for example, we're going to find thin epithelial tissues inside our lungs, and that will help with gas exchange. And we have thin epithelial tissue lining our small intestines, which helps us to absorb our nutrients, because it's easy to get things across a thin layer of tissue. So we were to find those thin tissues where we need to get stuff into and out of the body. Epithelial tissues have certain characteristics. One characteristic of an epithelial tissue is that it has a base and an apex, also called a basal surface and an apical surface. The base of the epithelial tissue is the side of the epithelial tissue that's facing another tissue. Right? And the apex of the epithelial tissue faces nothing, if you will. It faces like the lumen of a tube, so it's the space inside of a tube, or it might face the external environment, like the outside of our body. A few pictures to illustrate this. So here we see skin, right? And the outer layer of skin is made of epithelial tissue. So I have the base and the apex labeled here with 1 and 2, but see if you can decide which number is referring to the apex and which is referring to the base. Now if you said number 2 was the base, you're correct, because that layer of the tissue is facing another tissue, so that makes it the base, whereas number 1 is facing the outside world, so that makes it the apex. So here we see another example of the base and apex of an epithelial tissue. This area here would be the apex because it's not facing anything. And then down here we have the base of the epithelial tissue, and it's facing another tissue. Now underneath the base is actually something called the basement membrane, just like your house has a basement. Right? Epithelial tissues have a basement, and the basement membrane is really just a bunch of sticky proteins and carbohydrates that kind of glue the epithelial tissue to the next tissue. Another characteristic of epithelial tissues is that they are avascular. When we put the letter A in front of something in biology, it doesn't mean one like it does in English. A means not. So epithelial tissues are not vascular. So what does vascular mean? Vascular is referring to blood vessels. So epithelial tissues lack blood vessels. Now this area here is the epithelial tissue of skin. And notice it does not have any blood vessels. There are blood vessels close by, but they are not in the epithelial tissue because epithelial tissues are avascular. Now we still have cells in epithelial tissues, and these cells still require things like oxygen and water, and they still have waste that need to be removed, like urea and carbon dioxide. But they depend upon diffusion of those substances away or towards the nearby blood vessels in order to have them transported. And another characteristic of epithelial tissues that we don't see with other tissues is that epithelial tissues are really good at mitosis. They are one of the few tissues in the human body that can readily regenerate. Now, when we look at epithelial tissues, we'll see that we can classify them according to the shapes of the cells and the number of cell layers that we have. So we're going to come across 3 cell shapes: squamous, cuboidal, and columnar. Squamous as in squished, as in flat. cuboidal as in cube or square shaped, and columnar as in rectangular or column shaped. Then when it comes to the layering, we have two types of layering. We have simple layering, which means it's one cell layer thick from apex to base, or we have stratified layering, which means there is two or more cell layers from apex to base. So let's look at some examples. So here we see simple squamous epithelial tissue. It's simple because it's one cell layer thick from apex to base, and it's squished or flat. Below that we see the stratified squamous epithelial tissue. It's stratified because there are several layers from apex to base, and it's squamous because we always look at the cells at the apex to determine the cell shape. Because if you look at this tissue, the cells at the base look sort of cube-shaped, but we always name an epithelial tissue for how the cells look at the apex. So the cells at the apex look flat here, so this is stratified squamous epithelium. The next shape is the cuboidal shape, and obviously they're very cube-shaped. The first one is the simple cuboidal epithelial tissue, one cell layer thick from apex to base. Below that we see stratified cuboidal epithelial tissue, and in this particular picture we see three cell layers from apex to base. For our class, we will not be studying stratified cuboidal epithelium. Next we have the columnar epithelial tissues. We see the simple columnar, one cell layer thick from apex to base. Right? And then we have the stratified columnar. In this picture we see two cell layers from apex to base. For our class, we will also not be studying the stratified columnar epithelial tissue. The simple epithelial tissues tend to function, as I mentioned, in getting things into and out of the body, like gas exchange or nutrient absorption or maybe secretion of substances, whereas the stratified tissues tend to function in protection. There is one cell type, or excuse me, one layering type, I should say, that's not shown here, and that is the pseudostratified epithelium. Pseudo means false. So the pseudostratified epithelium is falsely stratified. It looks to be stratified, but if you look very carefully at it, it's not truly stratified. To be truly stratified, every cell has to touch the, excuse me, to be truly stratified, there has to be some cells that do not touch the base. Right? If you look at the example here, some of these cells do not touch the base. So this is a truly stratified tissue. A pseudostratified tissue, every single cell is touching the base, but it looks stratified. And I'll show you some examples in a little bit. Next, I'm going to show you some tissue examples. And for each of these, what you should know is the cell shape and layering, a location in the body where you'd find this tissue, a function for the tissue, and if the tissue has special characteristics, you should know those too. These are the epithelial tissues that we will not study in our class. The first tissue up is the simple squamous epithelial tissue. In this picture here, we see what you can think of as a bird's eye view of simple squamous epithelial tissue, so looking down at it from the top. This over here is also simple squamous epithelial tissue. This one's a little bit different because there isn't a base. It's all apex, so it's one cell layer thick, and the arrows are pointing to the apex, so there's basically nothing but apex here for the most part. One cell layer thick, squished in shape. And down here at the bottom, we're just looking at the cell layer here. And this still is simple squamous epithelial tissue, one cell layer thick. There's a clear apex and a clear base in this example. I'd like to look at this one in a little bit more detail. This is the simple squamous epithelial tissue that we'd find at the ends of your lungs. So your lungs contain a series of tubes that get smaller and smaller and smaller. And at the end of the smallest tubes, you have these things that look like little bubbles. And these bubbles are called alveoli. And the alveoli are the structures that are involved with gas exchange in the lungs. And the walls of the alveoli are composed of simple squamous epithelial tissue. It's really easy to get oxygen and carbon dioxide to cross this simple squished cell layer. In this picture here, we can see several examples of the simple squamous tissue. So here I'm going to highlight a few for you. The white spaces that we see in this picture are actually air spaces, so that's just spaces within the alveoli bubbles where we would find air. Now notice that we see things other than simple squamous epithelial tissue here. Partly covered up, we have a blood vessel right here that's would be found inside this tissue. And this is just a picture to kind of help you remember the function of this tissue. It's for gas exchange. Here we're looking at a cross-section of an artery and a vein. Now the layer of the artery and the vein that faces the lumen is composed of simple squamous epithelial tissue, and it actually has a special name called the endothelium. So this thin layer of squished cells called the endothelium lines the inside of all of your blood vessels, and it lines the inside of your heart. And the function of the endothelium is rather complicated. One of its functions is to provide a smooth, slippery surface that blood doesn't stick to. You don't want platelets sticking to the inside of your blood vessels at random, because then you get unwanted clotting, and that can lead to things like heart attack and stroke. So it's nice and thin and slippery and smooth like glass. This particular endothelium can also function in repair processes if blood vessels are broken. It's also involved with signaling. It's pretty complicated. Let's leave it at that. Let's look at an artist rendition of this tissue, because the actual histological slide's a little hard to see the simple squamous nature of the tissue. So here we see the one cell layer thick from apex to base and squished shape of these endothelial cells. And here's just another perspective of the same thing. Again, one cell layer thick, simple, squished in shape, squamous. Now here in this example, we're looking at the stratified squamous epithelial tissue. It's stratified because there are several cell layers from apex to base, and it's squamous because the cells at the apex are squished in shape. Now it turns out there's two main types of stratified squamous epithelial tissue that we find in the body. There's keratinized and non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelial tissue. The keratinized version is found as the outer layer of your skin, and the non-keratinized version tends to be found places where your skin goes in. So this would be like the mouth, vagina as examples. So let's take a look at these two different examples. They're both going to function in protection, but they look a little bit different. So let's take a look at these. So in this example here, we're looking at the outer layer of skin on the bottom of the foot, and this is what we call thick skin. The top picture is the actual picture from the histological slide, what we call a micrograph or a photomicrograph, and down below is the artist's rendition of that particular picture. You can see we have multiple cell layers from apex to base. The base is rather wavy. Important to note is that the cells here at the apex are dead, and we can tell they're dead because they don't possess a nucleus anymore. And we only see dead cells at the apex of the keratinized stratified squamous epithelial tissue. What happens is these epithelial tissues begin to produce keratin, and then they eventually die, and they're pushed through the layers of cells here. And so at the apex you end up with nothing but these cell membranes full of keratin, and the cell membranes kind of make skin waterproof, whereas the keratin provides strength to skin. So the function of this tissue is obviously very protective. So you only find the keratinized stratified squamous tissue as the outer layer of skin, and the way you can tell it's keratinized is because the cells are dead at the apex. Now over here, this is the non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelial tissue. Notice here that the cells at the apex are alive, and we can tell they're alive because they possess a nucleus. we're going to find non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelial tissue in places like the vagina or the mouth, as I mentioned, places where skin goes in. It's very protective, right? But it doesn't produce, the cells here don't produce the protein keratin, but it's still highly protective. So take a look at these two photomicrographs and see if you can tell which is the keratinized and which is the non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelial tissue. Next up is the simple cuboidal epithelial tissue. We're going to find this in places like in the kidneys. Turns out your kidneys have like millions of these tiny, tiny structures called nephrons, and nephrons are mostly made of these tiny tubes called tubules. And the walls of these tubules are made of simple cuboidal epithelial tissue. So here in this picture we can see both a longitudinal section and cross sections through these tubules in the kidney. Cubed in shape, one cell layer thick, so it's simple cuboidal. Right? So here's an example of an apex, and here's a base. Right? And it's the fact that it's simple is important because the job of these tubes is to reabsorb any important stuff that was filtered out of blood. So your kidneys filter your blood. And so good stuff ends up in these kidney tubules, good stuff like water and glucose that you don't want to go out in your urine. So you have to reabsorb it. And it's easy to get things to cross a simple layer of cells. So we can reabsorb that water and reabsorb that glucose quite easily across the simple cuboidal layering. And this is just another picture showing you the same thing of the simple cuboidal epithelial tissue. Again, looking at a longitudinal section and part of a cross section of a kidney tubule. What I like about this picture is it doesn't show us the shape of the cell. And so I wanted to give you some tips at this point. Sometimes when we look at epithelial tissues, we can't tell the shape of the cell. And if you can't tell the shape of the cell, how do you figure out if it's squamous or columnar or cuboidal? Well, if you can't tell the shape of the cell, look at the shape of the nucleus. Usually you can see the shape of the nucleus. If the nucleus is squished and flat, it's probably squamous. If the nucleus is very oval shaped, like an egg, it's probably a columnar shaped cell. But if the nucleus is round, likely the cell shape is cuboidal. Next up is the simple columnar epithelial tissue. Nice column-shaped cells from apex to base, just one cell layer thick. A lot of times these simple columnar cells will have microvilli at their apex, and the microvilli are folds of the cell membrane that increase the surface area for absorption. And you're going to find simple columnar tissue in places like your intestines where you absorb your nutrients. So it makes sense to have these microvilli, which increase the surface area for nutrient absorption. Sometimes we'll see goblet cells embedded in the simple columnar epithelial tissue. So here's a goblet cell here, and there's another one there. And goblet cells produce mucus, which is often used as a lubricant, or it can do things like help aid nutrient absorption too. So I mentioned that we're going to find simple columnar tissue lining the intestines, so it lines the layer facing the lumen of the intestines. We're also going to find simple columnar tissue like lining the inside of your stomach as another example. So at the bracket here we see simple columnar tissue. Apex to base, one cell layer thick, column in shape. Notice that you can't really see the microvilli. Microvilli are too small usually to be discerned with a regular microscope, so you usually can't see the microvilli at the apex. The artist renditions in these pictures make it look like you can see the microvilli, but if you look at the actual photomicrograph here, you can't really see the individual microvilli. It just looks like a layer at the surface. And usually you can't even see that. Next up is that tissue I mentioned called the pseudostratified tissue. It's falsely stratified. It looks stratified. If you look here, it looks like there's several layers of nuclei, so you'd think there's several layers of cells from apex to base. But in reality, every cell here is touching the base. If you look at the artist rendition, you can really clearly see that. It's hard to distinguish the pseudostratified columnar tissue from stratified columnar tissue. In our class, we're not even going to study the stratified columnar tissue, but one of the things that is often a characteristic of the pseudostratified columnar tissue is cilia at the apex. If you look at the apex here, we have what looks like microvilli, but these are not microvilli. These are larger. These are called cilia, and they are folds in the cell membrane, but they have a completely different function. Cilia are there to move things across the surface of the cell. For example, you're going to find pseudostratified ciliated epithelial tissue lining your trachea. What's going to happen is you're going to breathe in air and it's going to be full of debris and bacteria and stuff. And what's going to happen is the cilia is going to kind of pass a ball of mucus and dust and bacteria. It's going to pass that ball up your trachea by passing it along the cilia. Eventually that ball of gook will make its way to your mouth, and normally you just swallow it without even thinking about it. So cilia you can actually usually see in a histological slide. So you can see cilia normally with a regular microscope, as compared to the microvilli, which you can't normally see with a regular microscope. Here are some other examples of the ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue. From apex to base, it looks like there's many cell layers, but in reality every single cell here is touching the base. If you look at the apex, it looks like you want to pet it. It's fringy, like the fringe on a pillow, right? And if you're looking at a tissue and it's got a lot of fringe and it looks like something you want to pet, it's going to be the ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue. Now take a look at these two pictures and see if you can figure out which is just the simple columnar and which is the pseudostratified columnar.